Next, the ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee and the vice chair of the Senate Intelligence Committee on the challenges facing the intel community. Congressman Adam Schiff and Senator Mark Warner also spoke about the FISA reauthorization and Russia's interference in the 2016 elections. This was part of a summit hosted by the Intelligence and National Security Alliance and Armed Forces Communications and Electronics Association. It's 50 minutes.
Everybody, welcome back. Welcome back for day two of the summit, and in keeping with yesterday's session with Mr. Bossert, the hectic schedules are in play, and the commitment by the members for the summit are notable. And Senator Warner and Representative Schiff both juggled their schedules this morning to make this happen. Unfortunately, their schedules didn't match up, so we're going to be speaking with each of them sequentially. Also, this afternoon, Director of National Intelligence Coates is required at a White House meeting, and he won't be available, but fortunately, Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence Sue Gordon will speak to us instead, and it'll be one of Sue's first public appearances in her new role. Let me reiterate the importance of your questions, and in particular early submission of the questions using the email questions@intelsummit.org for the first preliminary, and due to the short periods of time for each of the guests, get the questions in early, and nice, concise ones will be much appreciated. Also, let me reemphasize the continued opportunities to interact with the exhibitors and also our appreciation to the sponsors of this event. And at this point, I'd like to introduce Ms. Suzanne Kelly, who's the CEO and publisher of the Cipher Brief, who will moderate the discussions with both Congressman Schiff and Senator Warner. Ms. Kelly.
Thank you very much. Appreciate being here. Thank you. Welcome to everyone this morning. I hope you're geared up for a great conversation.
I am, and I'm delighted to be in a situation where the House gets to go first. I want to compliment INSA for recognizing the proper order of things this morning.
Yes, well, I wonder what went on behind the scenes. We'll have to get down to the bottom of that. It's fantastic to have you here. You know, with so much going on in the intelligence community, so much of it showing up in sound bites on television on a daily basis, so much politics back and forth. When you take a deep breath and you sit back and you look at all the things we're dealing with, security clearance reform, an investigation into Russia, the 702 coming up for renewal later this year, how do you prioritize what you think is the most important?
Well, it is an enormous challenge this year in particular, because in addition to all of our day job responsibilities of oversight, we've also had the Russia investigation layered on top. And it's not as if the other issues went away or went on hiatus. When I think back, and I think all of us have felt a kind of a time-distorting effect of this year, where things that happened just yesterday seem like it must have been a week or a month ago. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, you know, I think we've done a very good job not only juggling these competing responsibilities, but also compartmentalizing our differences. And to give you a very graphic example, the chairman and I obviously have our differences over the Russia investigation, but we decided we were going to compartmentalize the oversight work the committee does and not let any differences we had on Russia interfere with what we had to do in terms of our oversight, with our authorization responsibilities. And so we produced, after our numerous hearings and review of documents and interviews and whatnot, a very bipartisan Intelligence Authorization Act that allocates the funding levels and provides the protections that we need in terms of people's privacy, and passed it overwhelmingly both in committee and on the House floor. That doesn't get the same attention as some of the twists and turns in the Russia investigation, but obviously is quite central to our responsibility. 702 will be another challenge. We've got a pretty good track record, though, when you look at how we accomplished the reform of the metadata program, how we passed information sharing legislation, the cyber information sharing legislation. So we have a history to build on. And I'm confident that we'll get through the 702 debate, I hope, in a thoughtful way.
So are you saying that it works much better than it appears to on network and cable news every day?
Well, it would
have
to, by definition, work much better than it appears, because it couldn't work much worse than it appears. I think a lot of the work that needs to get done does get done, doesn't get the same attention, and is obviously of vital importance. I view our committee as having perhaps the most difficult oversight job in the Congress, because when you serve on one of the other committees and you're doing oversight, if you're on the Transportation Committee and the agencies come in and they're talking about high-speed rail and what a great project it is and how well it's going and how it's on budget and on time and all the rest of that, there are any number of outside stakeholders who can hold those witnesses accountable and can provide information to the committee and say, that's not true and this isn't right and you need to ask these questions. In our arena, where most of our hearings are in closed session, we don't have the outside stakeholders to the same degree able to give us input, insight, help us to ask the right questions or know when we're not getting a complete answer. So that's a very challenging oversight responsibility, but I think we're doing a pretty good job.
So that sounds like a very serious, maybe not flaw, but a default in the system that you have to overcome somehow, because you do have such incredible responsibilities with oversight of these programs that are constantly being judged by the American people when they hear snippets about what the program entails or what it doesn't. It's very difficult to know what to believe and to get the right information out there. How do you personally handle that when you don't have those outside people who you can go to kind of bring the level of expertise?
Well, one of the most important decisions we make is when we hire our staff. We bring people in often who have experience in the agencies, who do know a lot of the right questions to ask and have the background expertise to help us with our oversight. We also depend to a great deal, a great extent, on the professionalism of the people working within the IC, both on the government side and on the contractor side, to be candid with us, not just in answer to our questions, but also to bring us problems when they occur. And, I think that has, by and large, happened. So we benefit from the professional workforce that we deal with. At the same time, human nature is human nature. People don't necessarily like to volunteer their faults or problems. And people become vested in the way they've approached issues or programs. And so we need to continue to challenge the agencies to do better and, continue to demand accountability in terms of what we're paying for certain programs, whether something that we've been doing the same way for a long time continues to be justified, whether we're getting the kind of results, whether we're setting the kind of metrics. So we have to be demanding, but I think that we benefit from a very capable staff and the professionalism within the IC.
You feel like you're getting the cooperation you need from the people you are overseeing? Yes.
There have been very, very few times where I've felt like we were getting misinformation. Mm-hmm. There's certainly times where I have disagreed with a briefer or their conclusion or their opinion or questioned the underlying facts that are being presented. But it's not a situation where I think people are deliberately trying to mislead us. Mm-hmm. There are times, I think, when we have a fresh perspective, not having become wedded to a certain approach. That can be very helpful and constructive, and I'm sure from the witness's point of view, they may view it differently and think that we don't have anywhere near the experience and time on task that they do, which is certainly correct. Mm-hmm. But it seems to work at the end of the day. And, obviously in this kind of an era where we're dealing with new challenges in the form of terrorism and asymmetric warfare, but also now information wars with very capable adversaries and a burgeoning cyber field, we all need to work together to make sure that we have the capabilities we need to defend the country.
So what do you think the biggest challenges are right now? I mean, you wake up and read the same newspapers and websites and everything else that the rest of us do. When we see what's happening with North Korea, we're trying to prepare and make sure things are in place for another election. where you're dealing with federal level and state levels and possible attempts to try to manipulate messaging around those elections. How do you kind of prioritize these things?
You know, it's very difficult because, you know, our tendency, I think, like most institutions, is to focus on the most immediate problem,
right?
Which is not necessarily the biggest problem or the most long-term problem, or the problem that requires you to be able to allocate resources in a way that builds over time. I'm astounded, you know, just with the crush of things going on, for example, that so little attention is being paid to the fact that Raqqa is going to fall soon. Soon, we hope. But we had the successful retaking of Mosul. Raqqa is going to fall. The last major urban holdings of the so-called caliphate are about to disappear, you know, which is an important success on the battlefield. But it's gotten almost no attention just because of everything else going on. That doesn't mean by any means the war against ISIS is over or even nearing conclusion.
Or no longer a threat.
Or no longer a threat.
Right.
It's
we
just,
always worry about how is it going to impact us here at home, right?
Yes.
We need to see that thread drawn, that connection made. Do you think that's happening enough in the news?
Well, on certain things, sure. I mean, on Korea, for example, people have a very vivid sense of the threat when they look at, okay, these missiles now can reach anywhere in the United States, and maybe they can carry a nuclear payload, and if they can't today, maybe they can tomorrow. In terms of the ISIS threat, okay, great news that the physical caliphate is disappearing, but what about the virtual caliphate that really, in many respects, holds much more danger to Americans in the sense of people being radicalized online and carrying out attacks in the name of ISIS.
Here in this country. Right?
Here in this country, exactly. But, you know, I do think that in terms of at least the two threats that are most in the news these days, the threat from North Korea and the threat from Russia, people are quite vividly aware of the nature and dimension of those threats. How we're going to confront them, though, we still have a lot of work to do.
Let me just ask you, too, and then I'm going to get to some of the questions from audience members as well in just a moment here. We've already got some of them coming in here. Let's just talk really quickly about 702, because I think that's also another one that really has an incredible impact on the United States' ability to collect information and protect privacy of its citizens, right? Both are at stake with this. What happens the day after if it is not reauthorized?
I don't think that's, first of all, I don't think that's going to happen. That is a failure to reauthorize 702. I think the only question is what form the reauthorization will take. I hope I'm not being overly optimistic about that, but I think it would be irresponsible for us. And yes, we've done a lot of irresponsible things in Congress, so that doesn't preclude that.
Shocking. Can I get you to say that just one more time?
We've actually probably done more irresponsible things by omission than by commission, but in any case, I think we will reauthorize. It's just a question of what kind of reforms we make to it. And here, it won't surprise people that the old adage of where you stand depends on where you sit has resonance in the sense that members of the Judiciary Committee, which have a very important oversight role, have one perspective. Members of the Intel Committee have a slightly different perspective. It's not that we don't appreciate the civil liberties and civil rights issues, we certainly do, or that the Judiciary Committee doesn't appreciate the Intel benefit and significance of what the program does. But in the committee, of course, we live day to day with the understanding of how important that is to our national security. And also, I think having a vivid understanding of how the program works is important, and what the evidence has been in terms of have there been problems with the execution, have there been any intentional abuses of it, and also with respect to proposed reforms, what's the real downstream consequence of that? Does the criminal justice model of seeking a court approval, for example, to do a U.S. person search of the 702 database, is that really the right model? Does that work here? What happens if the U.S. person identity you're searching is a potential victim, not a perpetrator, or a place, not a person, or an address? So having an intimate understanding of the program helps in terms of what we think is a viable reform and what may not be.
And abuse of power is a big question, right? For people who don't understand exactly how the program works and they're hearing the headlines, the abuse of power, that's where the congressional oversight comes into play. Are you confident with the way the system is running right now, with your ability to oversee when there are cases where someone is misusing certain access they may or may not have?
I do feel pretty confident about our ability to oversee this. I hope that's not wishful thinking, but I don't think it is. And it's not just because of the work we're doing or just because of the fact that the agencies do come in and self-report when they have problems, but also that we have the tremendous value added by the FISA court, by the fact that the FISA court itself does, I think, very rigorous review of these programs, and where they find problems, they they often will suspend an effort till they get the results they want, or they'll change what a program can do until they get the results they want. We will have access to those opinions and the concerns raised by the FISA court. So I think the combination of what the courts do in their oversight, what we do in our oversight, what the agencies do in their self-reporting is pretty comprehensive.
And working.
And working.
Great. Okay, let me keep going on my promise and get to some of these questions. A lot of what the audience is thinking about right now, oversight resources, 702 reauthorization, and the question about election security. Let's get to one of those questions. Do you believe the United States government is doing enough to prepare for another cyber attack against our elections? Given that elections are principally a state responsibility, what role should the intelligence community play? It's an interesting question.
I don't think we're doing enough, and coming from a state with such a powerful technology industry, when I meet with tech experts and talk about the machinery of the elections, they tell me, and I have every reason to believe that they are knowledgeable on this, that these systems are not impregnable. They are vulnerable, and I felt for quite some time, well before this past election, that any state or any voting jurisdiction that doesn't maintain a paper trail is negligent in this day and age. So, I think there's a lot more that we need to do. There's a lot more that we need to understand. I think the vendors of these voting machines need to be much more transparent with the government about their systems and their software so that we can analyze vulnerabilities. The states have to be willing to accept the government help that is being offered. And the government and the IC has to be more transparent with the states. The states still don't know if they were victims of Russian hacking. We have not shared that information with the states. I think that's crazy. And I know my colleague Mark Warner has been very outspoken on this, and properly so. I hope that we will have a hearing in our committee, an open hearing, where we can bring in some of the state elections people to talk about the vulnerability that they feel in terms of their infrastructure and the need for us to be more forthcoming with them. But we learn each and every day. Today there was a report by Symantec, or within the last 24 hours, about the vulnerability of our power grid, the fact that outside hackers have been able to get into the operational parts of those systems, not just probe some of the outlying parts of those systems. And we find that those systems are far more vulnerable than people may have expected.
And we've been talking about it for years, but we haven't really done a lot to protect the critical infrastructure. Well, a lot of studies, a lot of meetings, a lot of talking.
The big area that fell out of the cyber information sharing bill was the effort to deal with critical infrastructure. That was one area that there was simply too wide a gulf between the parties in terms of what's the federal government's role in protecting critical infrastructure. So, it is largely set by private industry. Now, there are obviously a lot of incentives for private industry to improve their security, but whether those incentives are sufficient or not is an open question. I will say that the fact that there's still vulnerabilities doesn't mean that nothing is being done. What it does mean in some cases is that this is a very asymmetric field where the advantages are all on the offensive, because those on offense only need to find one open door, and those on defense need to bar every window and lock every door. And that's inherently challenging, and it's a particularly inviting field for adversaries because there's always going to be plausible deniability. We've gotten very good at attribution, but our adversaries know that we're never going to make public the full capability we have to attribute. And so they'll always have some level of deniability.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'd love to talk about so many issues. We've got some great questions here on Russian influence, but I know we're running out of time and that you have another appointment you need to get to this morning. But let me ask one more question following up on that answer about the cyber workforce. This is a great question from the audience. What is Congress doing to build the federal cyber workforce? How can the IC compete with these private companies to attract personnel with the right training? How can they pay them what they can make, and especially given the state you're coming from? Is a cyber reserve corps a real possibility in the near future, and might that bring any benefit?
Well, first of all, we can't compete financially with the Silicon Valley. I mean, some of the bright, capable people start in the Silicon Valley with salaries higher than yours or mine.
Yeah.
Certainly higher than mine, and a lot of people in the audience.
Probably mine too.
I'm sure that's true. So we're benefited by the fact that a lot of people choose to work in the IC because they feel a sense of patriotism and calling. And it draws them to that, and a lot of very patriotic people feel the same call to work within the private sector that are serving the IC. So that's tremendously beneficial. But we do need to continually work to recruit people. We need to continue working on diversifying the IC workforce. We also, I think, do need to explore creative ways to bring people in from industry for a period of years, then have them go back into industry.
Yeah, I've heard that a lot, that there would be real benefit from that.
It would be, and they're great models for that. If you look at ARPA-E, for example, some brilliant people going into next generation energy technologies. They bring the knowledge they have from the private sector, they add value to the government, they go back to the private sector. There are obviously some difficulties and added complications in an IC environment, but nothing that can't be overcome, and I think we do need to look to these models as well as some of the interesting partnerships that already exist in terms of venture capital with the Silicon Valley.
Yes, absolutely. Okay, I know we need a seamless congressional transition here this morning, so I'm going to thank you very much for taking the time to come here. I know you're very busy, answer some of these questions. There are a lot more fantastic questions here, which I think we should have all forwarded to your office, and your very overqualified staffers would be happy to answer, because these are great questions. Thank you very much for submitting them. If we could also invite Senator Warner, I think he is here, or was supposed to be here about now. I'm trying to keep my eye on everything. We have a few more minutes? Oh, he's late. We get to talk. Okay, even better, because I do think we should talk a little bit about the Russia question. So let me pull up. What is this?
Wait, I think I see Senator Warner. I'm kidding.
I believed you. Okay, what is the scope and scale of Russian influence operations in the United States? It's just a small little question that we can, buy time with.
Yeah. Well, of course, that's really what we're aiming to find out. We're looking at each of the modalities the Russians have used elsewhere, some of which we, know with great certainty they employed here during the election, and others where we still need to find out were these tactics that the Russians used. I do want to make one point, because I know we have limited time, but getting to an earlier question of yours that's also implicated here in the sense of what do we do about all this?
Yeah.
There is no software patch for what happened last year. There is no cyber defense capable enough. If the Russians want to get into the DNC in 2020, they'll get in. If they want to get into the RNC, they will get in. Really, the best protection that we can have is somehow forging the consensus we didn't have last year, that no matter who it may help or who it may hurt, if any foreign power intervenes in our affairs, let alone our elections, they will be repudiated. And anyone who tries to take advantage of it will be repudiated. More than anything else, I think that's what we need to defend ourselves, because what has been unleashed is not going to be put back in the bottle, and it's not going to be just an issue with Russia. It will be an issue with any country that wants to influence our affairs, and moreover, it'll be an issue for lots of other countries in their own relationship with each other.
You know what worries me, and I wonder if it worries you, when you look at influence operations, and you look at how we're getting news today, and you look at fake news and what's fake and what's not, you look at we're getting it through social media channels, is there more of a responsibility that needs to be placed on the consumer of the news to question things that don't quite seem like they fit a pattern that, let's say they saw a story yesterday, when things are coming out of left field? Should we all be talking about putting more responsibility on the part of the person receiving news to say, wait a second, I'm going to throw up a BS flag?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this, I think, is a challenge for Americans. It's a challenge for people around the world. I've often found it bewildering that in Russia, for example, where during Soviet times people were so disbelieving of what they read in Pravda or Izvestia, and they recognized that it was merely the party line.
Propaganda.
People now are so believing of the Russian media. It's extraordinary, and I wonder what happened to the Russian skepticism of what their government has to say. But I think we all need to bring a certain inherent skepticism. I think we should also take a very serious look at what Facebook has just revealed publicly in terms of its own analysis.
Yes.
And one thing in particular, the Russians, and this is completely consistent with what the intelligence community found in its unclassified assessment, wanted, among other things, to sow discord in the United States. And look at what they were doing. Look at the issues they were choosing to grow the divisions in America. We ought to recognize that for what it is, which is this is a vulnerability that they see we have, these terrible divisions within our country. And if they feel that's a vulnerability, we need to recognize it as a vulnerability, and we need to do something about it. And this is why, I think it's so important from the very top on down that we make an effort to bridge these divisions, not aggravate them any further. And now I do see my Senate colleague.
Yes, I think he's here. And we'd like to thank you. I don't want you to rush off because I think we'd like to get a quick photograph. So if we could have everyone in the audience come on. No, I'm kidding. Congressman Schiff, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Senator Warner, welcome. Thank you for being
Senator,
here.
how are you? Good to see you.
And Chuck, did we need to get a quick photo?
So bear with us while we get a quick picture here and do a transition.
It's all the behind the scenes.
And to both of our guests here for juggling their schedules, for making this work, a big thank you. Okay?
So, Senator,
thank you very much. So when you pass each other in the halls, well, I guess you don't do that quite often, but when you do, what do you say to each other?
Before you arrived, we were talking about how INSA got the proper order of things and having the House go before the Senate. So just wanted to share that with you.
You're always the warm-up.
I'm going to step out of this.
Good to see you.
Thanks, Adam. Thanks, Adam.
I'll invite you to have a seat right over here. Thank you very much, Congressman Schiff. It was very nice to see you this morning. Thank you.
Thanks, Adam.
Well, welcome. Hard to follow that, huh?
Wild days. How's my days? Well, in full disclosure, I was doing an interview and I jumped out of the car and grabbed a jacket. And unfortunately, I grabbed my aide's jacket, who's about 6 inches shorter than me. I'm not sure that's reflective of being a senator or vice chair of the Intel department, but it's either that or my August, I put on an awful lot more weight than I thought. But,
you're going to get yourself in trouble.
I'm going to get myself in trouble on that. Yeah.
Well, welcome, and thank you for taking the time. I know you're also on a very tight schedule this morning, so we appreciate you being here. And we have a very well-informed audience on all of the issues that you're tackling on a day-to-day basis. And we kind of ticked through a number of sort of high-priority things with Congressman Schiff. And I'd like to give you the same opportunity to do that as well. I know there are a number of issues, 702 being one of them we talked about a little bit this morning, security clearance reform being another. How big is a cyber threat? Just kind of walk me through when you wake up and you turn on the news or you read the paper, that moment of like, oh, wow, what next?
Well, let me step back and first of all, kind of, even before I wake up, a couple of general comments. One, this opportunity to be the vice chair of the Intel Committee is probably my greatest opportunity I've had in the Senate. It still remains as one of the committees that actually still functions on a bipartisan way, that gets bills out, that works through issues in ways that I think are appropriate. And I've been, generally very, very pleased with how our committee, for example, has taken on the whole Russia investigation. And I feel as a Virginia guy, it's kind of, I've got an extra both burden and responsibility since so many of our intelligence professionals, either live in or retire to Virginia. So
they know where you live.
Feel like I'm the local home guy.
Right.
And I think it's really important. It's one of the reasons why I was so frustrated both during the transition and, in the early days of the administration. I've got a lot of differences with the president, but where the president didn't seem to have that kind of respect for the intelligence community. I think that's been troubling. I think it's challenged
Has it gotten
morale.
any better?
I think he is growing to understand that you cannot be the President of the United States without having a strong relationship with your intelligence community. And I think that's gotten better. But, for a community that doesn't get the thanks and the appreciation on a regular basis that it deserves, it's got to have respect if we're going to continue to attract world-class talent. And if the community is going to be able to continue to do its most important responsibility, which is speak truth to power and not be politicized.
So we've got Mike Pompeo in place now, who seems to be working very well with the president. We've got Dan Coats. We've got the appointment of Sue Gordon as Dan Coats' deputy, which is phenomenal.
Long time frame.
Yeah, so do you feel confident that things are working more now? Are we getting a little bit more away from the politics, focused on the substance and actually the issues that are going to impact all of us, regardless of political party?
Yes, I think there is progress. I give, we've had with, if you think about Robert Cardillo and Sue Gordon and Trish and obviously Admiral Rogers, a lot of the community has stayed in place. Mike Pompeo has got a good background, come to the CIA. Dan Coats served with me for years, obviously a great appreciation of the IC. So I think we have made progress there. I think some of the areas that may not kind of rise to the level of the news on a regular basis, there are things that are a little bit nitty-gritty that I'm still very interested in. For example, one of the things that Jim Clapper and I spent a long time with in his last year was, can we make sure that the oversight program or the eyesight program, for example, the notion of a uniform IT backbone across the whole IC, kind of nerdy, but when you're talking about how we communicate and how we can make sure that there's better ability to move past silos, something very, very important. The question of clearances, this has been a problem for ages. Our Intel bill that we passed out of the Senate committee, we start a reform process there, long overdue. The process, particularly if we're going to continue to attract world-class talent, and if we're going to think about not only bringing in people, as they kind of come out of school, but as we think about mid-career transitions into the agency and into the Intel community, you can't have this 12, 18-month, 24-month security process, a security clearance process. So we've tried to say more uniformity across all of the agencies. You shouldn't have to duplicate that. I think the main systemic change we're trying to push is, rather than having a arbitrary every 5-year re-review, this ought to be more risk-based. It ought to be more ongoing. There are clearly models actually from the private sector around security that we can, I think, implement on the IC side. One other area I want to kind of get out before we get to 702 and Russia and all the other things is, an area that I kind of dived into for some time over the last couple of years as a former guy from tech was the whole question of our overhead architecture. And I'm a big believer that we need to move from the world where we built on a 10-year cycle the world's most exquisite overhead architecture, and we had a procurement process that said we're going to take a year to two to get your requirements, and then a 5 to 10-year period before we move from design to launch. That just doesn't make sense in a world where in overhead, things are changing on a 2-year basis, and we're building sometimes, I think, multi-billion-dollar platforms in the sky that are exquisite. But I felt like, in a way, that for a long time, nobody in the IC community had ever seen a James Bond movie, because back to the early days of the James Bond movies, the bad guys always used laser beams to blow up satellites. Well, now we're seeing that. So I think we're seeing, and I compliment the NRO and others about moving from that kind of old-style architecture and procurement process to something much quicker, much more agile, much smaller, much more use of commercial. And again, these are areas that don't always necessarily make the headlines, but where a lot of our capacity and needs to kind of continue to move the community forward.
I love that. I feel like we're getting into some good substantive issues, and all of this kind of pulls together into what you need to do with providing good oversight and making sure that we're allocating resources we need to. Let me ask a question from the audience here. Global coverage. It says, with finite resources, the IC is focused on hard targets and terrorism. Countries like Guinea might not be important until there's a coup or a pandemic that affects U.S. interests. But at such a point, we need to understand dynamics in the affected region. Does the IC have an adequate understanding of so-called global coverage countries? Very interesting question.
That is I think there is a growing recognition that problems can pop up anywhere.
Yeah.
And I think if we think about it, in the last 30 years, we've been counterterrorism, we've been Russia, we've been China, we've been North Korea, we've been Iran. But when we're thinking about environmental challenge, when we're thinking about pandemics, when we're thinking about the emergence of terrorism and revolutionary forces that are external just to their specific country, you got to have a broader footprint, and that means we need greater collaboration with our allies. We cannot do it all alone. It means greater usage of open source documents, and it also pushes us completely into the fact that a group of dedicated activists in some small country can actually challenge our nation, particularly within the cyber domain, because it's so asymmetrical. So I think thinking through this broader coverage rather than simply checking the boxes is an issue that both the community and we from the oversight capacity need to kind of think through.
Do you have time to think about what's coming next when you're living in a day-to-day environment where you have 20 things popping up on the radar, really 10 of which need immediate attention? Do you have time, the time that you need to plan for those things that are going to have a broader impact overall?
Well, it's not like the Congress is getting a lot done in other areas.
Can you say that again for me?
No, listen, I think you got to carve out the time. And one of the things that Richard and I, on his chairmanship and my vice chairmanship, is we try to think through, all right, let's not just, I felt like the first few years I was on the committee, being on the committee was a little like being in a kid's soccer game. The meetings were whatever was the hot spot that week, whatever the bad guys were doing that week in whatever specific location.
So you're reacting.
Yeah, and I think we need to be more proactive and forward-leaning.
Has it changed since, from your personal experience?
I think we're trying to move it in that direction, but as you mentioned, there's always something that requires immediate attention. We're going to get a classified brief on North Korea today. That is absolutely critical. But we have to also be able to sort through what are these emerging threats. I've been, for example, I've been saying since the beginning of the Russia investigation that I have real concerns about the way Americans, and for that matter, the world, takes in news. I think that, and I think Adam was probably, I didn't hear all his comments, but taking on this at the end. And it appeared to me that, the very social media sites that we rely on for virtually everything, our Facebook, Googles, and Twitters, it was my belief that the Russians were using those sites to intervene in our elections. And, the first reaction from Facebook, of course, was, oh, you're crazy. Nothing's going on. Well, we find yesterday there actually was something going on. And I think all we saw yesterday in terms of their brief was the tip of the iceberg. I want them back in. I want to see Twitter back in. I want to see others come back in. Not to be necessarily critical, because you've seen, for example, in the case of Facebook, they denied any that they were being used in any way. Yet by the time, and didn't do anything, but by the time of the French elections, Facebook, working with the French, took down 50,000 accounts. Yeah. So, here is an emerging threat and challenge that we've got to see from the IC side, but we also, it breaks us into the whole legislative side. For example, even in the craziness after the with unlimited campaign contributions flowing in to our campaigns, an American can still figure out what content is being used on TV advertising. You can look at it, you can go look at the ad, you may not be able to find completely the source, but in social media there's no such requirement. So, we may need legislative solutions that come out of it. There may be a reform process here that I actually think the social media companies would not oppose, because I think Americans, when it particularly comes to elections, ought to be able to know if there is foreign-sponsored content coming into their electoral process.
Right.
That's an area that's a brand new field. Does it just fall on the IC side? Not necessarily, but as we think about how we become more and more dependent upon our devices, that becomes a method of influence exponentially, I would argue, almost bigger than TV and radio.
And that's what we had talked just briefly about before. I kind of approach it with the soccer mom mentality of, okay, I understand what people in political parties are saying, and I understand that they're gaining momentum based on what their messaging is, and if they're delivering the message their audience wants to hear, there's probably you win Senate seats on catering to the people who support you. But is that necessarily the best thing for America? I think that's a great point that you brought up about being a little bit more critical of where you're getting information.
This is a brand new world. We are communicating and we are receiving information in a different way. The IC's got to understand that, and we've got to sort through it.
Okay, let's get to a few of these other fantastic issues. Space. Do we have the policies, the organizations, the capabilities in place to optimize our utilization, I can say that, of the space domain? Are we able to effectively deny our adversaries use of that space domain? That's a great question.
I don't think we can deny our adversaries the use of space. What I worry about is, do we have the resilience, the flexibility, can we move away from the model of this exquisite government best technical means to a more distributed system? Because I would argue in many ways our enormous communications reliance on space, our enormous systems reliance, our enormous overhead capacity in terms of radar and electro-optical makes us in many ways more vulnerable. Because if I go back to my James Bond analogy, we thought we were going to control and dominate space forever. Now we're able to see nations, not just major nations, but potentially even smaller nations, have the capacity, to, if they can jam or interfere with those devices, that potentially even makes us more vulnerable. So how do we think lower? And then also, how do we think, just again, I'm kind of obsessed on the overhead piece. We think about how we need, enormously greater coverage of North Korea. But as we think about even if we can get the space coverage, do we have the ground capacity to review all the data that comes in?
Another great.
So this needs, again, a whole new systemic approach.
Humongous problems. You mentioned innovation regarding satellites. Innovative technology companies have a hard time working through the federal procurement process, right? They may have the technology and they can't sell it. To what degree has the intelligence community incorporated cutting-edge technologies from startups and smaller tech companies, and have entities like In-Q-Tel, IARPA, and DIUX helped in this regard?
Well, we're making progress. And I do want to make the point again that while there's some great innovation going on in the Silicon Valley in overhead, there's also a lot of great innovation going on in the greater Washington area, particularly on the Virginia side. Here, so we need to look in both spaces, but we also have to, and I would say this is both on the DoD and the IC side, we've got to move our procurement process away from being so risk adverse. It's always easier to go with the big brand name. We've got to move on a more innovative side, and again, the chairman and I have, and he's really come around on this. I want to give Richard a lot of credit. You can't have a 2-year requirement cycle and then a 5 to 10 year procurement and launch cycle when you've got, my background, as many of you know, was in the cell phone business. Back in the mid-'80s, Wall Street and the telcos thought it would take 30 years to build out a single cell phone system, and at the end of that 30 years, 5% of Americans would have cell phones. They were wrong, and I got rich because I started Nextel and a series of other companies. I feel like we're in that same transition in satellites, and we have to move much faster, much more rapidly. We may not get it all right, and we've got to move to much, much smaller.
So how do we do that? What's your role in making that happen?
Well, we have been very specific with our colleagues in the IC that they've got to speed up the requirements in the procurement process. And I think I've seen a real positive movement forward.
You have?
Yes.
So you think we're headed in the right way?
I think we're headed in the right direction.
At a fast enough pace?
Well, if again, we're just taking overhead. If you look at the transition on the commercial side in satellite just in the last 3 years, and from, the cost of the bird to the launch costs, there it was 1/10 the cost. Now, in many cases, it's 1/50th the cost of what we're talking about.
We have a question here on POTUS information sources. Without getting too political, I'm going to throw this out there and see what happens. Most presidents have relied upon the intelligence community's objective, nonpartisan analysis for information about global developments. Do you think President Trump is drawing on the intelligence community's insights to inform policy decisions? And I'm going to just add on a last question to that. Do you think that's changed from a president who was just coming into office, who had no experience working with an intelligence community, to one who has now been in office, has people in place of the leaderships of these intelligence communities? Have you seen a change and a shift in his reliance on and confidence in the IC's assessments? A face is worth 1,000 words.
The combined knowledge, experience, an analysis of the IC versus Breitbart? I sure as hell hope so. But listen, that is a continuing worry, I think, of.
Do you not think it's
I think that
getting
is a
any better?
continuing worry
Do you
of
think
members
as
of
he
both
learns
parties.
sort of the job?
Listen, it's critical. I want the president to succeed. For his sake, but most importantly for our country's sake.
Yeah.
And he has to learn that. But it has been a slower process than I'd hoped. How's that for a PC answer?
I just want everyone to get along. I just want to take the focus onto these issues that are actually going to impact all of us. But I agree. It's frustrating from the person outside of Washington to look at what's going on and think, are we doing the best we can?
But that is where, again, I think the IC's role really goes up exponentially and more important. I mean, the notion, not just that a president, but for an average American consumer of information, the amount of information sources that overwhelm you.
Yeah.
And, this goes where, when the normal question we get is, what keeps you up the most at night in terms of these traditional threats?
Right.
I wouldn't put those 5. I would put the asymmetrical threat around cyber really bothers me more. It bothers me in terms of the fact, and I think Adam raised this as well, it drives me crazy that we've had 21 states that were broken into, and we still have almost a Kafkaesque response that we can't share with the top election official because they don't have appropriate clearances.
Right.
We've got to be better prepared. I know I'm going in just 1 minute. We've got to, if you look at the fact that we've got 10 billion devices that are connected, IoT devices to the internet at this point, we're going to go to 25 billion. We don't have any security built into most of those devices. Each of those can be, if not weaponized, taken over. When we think about the whole notion that of our technological advance also makes us more technologically vulnerable. So sorting through how we get our information, and not in a way that interferes with First Amendment rights, but Americans deserve to have the knowledge of what is at least the source of the information so they can make a judgment. And I think we all have to use our tools more. And that, again, means for the IC, both to the president and to the Congress, boy, oh boy, their responsibility to kind of analyze, sort, and get this information to policymakers is more important than ever.
It's critical. So I know that you have to go as well, and so we're going to wrap up, but I want to ask you one more question. When you look at the role of Congress and all of these issues that we've talked about this morning, and their responsibilities, give me an honest answer of what can Congress do better? What can just, when you're looking in your own backyard, what can Congress do better?
Well, I would argue, beyond just the IC.
beyond the IC.
Yeah, what I would say is, I was at a dinner last night for John Warner, and it was a series of, folks talking about the good old days of Congress when people would get together. I think I would argue there are two things we can do. I think that committees and committee chairs need to take some of the power back and not have Congress continually driven simply by the Democratic or Republican leadership, number one. And number two, I think in this day and age, we need to realize that most of the issues from our kind of economic challenges, I would argue, as somebody who was blessed to do well in business, the fundamental challenge that we have from an economic standpoint is how do you actually make modern capitalism work for enough people again? And we have to understand that most of the issues we are arguing about are frankly 20th century issues. We're relitigating liberal versus conservative, left versus right, when more of the issues are future versus past. And if we can reset that framework on that future versus past, I think there may be a whole way for a new set of alignments. The vast majority, I can't speak for the House, but the vast majority of members of the Senate get along, at least privately agree on 80% of the issues, and we ought to produce a lot better product for the American people than we're producing at this point.
That's a great thought to end on. I thank you very much.
Thank you.
For your
Thanks,
time
everybody.
this morning.
Thank you for your service.
Thank you for the excellent questions as well. It's very nice to see you. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Intelligence experts from the U.S., Canada, the U.K., and Germany talked about the terrorism threat to each of their respective countries. The discussion was part of an event hosted by the Intelligence and National Security Alliance and Armed Forces Communications and Electronics Association. This is an hour and 10 minutes.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome to the stage Chuck Alsup, President of the Intelligence and National Security Alliance.
So, here we are, last session of the morning before lunch. I'm not sure that's the best thing for these guys. Last year, when we were wrapping up the summit, and Tish and I were talking, kind of saying, oh, geez, how well that went, and doing some self-congratulation and so forth, but then we got serious and said to ourselves, what do we need to do better here? And we will ask you later, after we wrap up, to give us your feedback for this year. But last year, when we were going through that, a couple of things were apparent to us quite quickly. One was, as Tish always likes to remind me, we need to always be thinking about diversity on our panels. Okay? And we're going to continue to do better on that. The second thing that we thought about was, this intelligence business is increasingly an international business. And so we knew we wanted to do something that brought an international flavor to this summit this year. I won't preach, but the business of intelligence is no longer about just secrets. It's a global business now. And no nation can maintain the global awareness that they want in this information age without cooperation. We got a pretty good start with Five Eyes, but I think we all know that we need to do better than just Five Eyes. This really is a global effort to make sure that we keep our respective nations safe. I've got the pleasure to introduce the guy that's going to lead this discussion. The guy that needs no introduction, and that's Charlie Allen. But the couple of things I will highlight about Charlie, 47 years at the CIA, 4 years as the Undersecretary of Homeland Security for Intelligence and Analysis, now with the Chertoff Group, but an amazing friend and volunteer to both AFCEA and INSA. An awful lot of this conference, specifically this panel, but several other aspects of this conference wouldn't have been possible without Charlie. I'm going to leave it to Charlie to introduce our panelists, but I wanted to personally thank Patty and Chris and Friedrich and Nick for participating today. So over to you, Charlie.
Thank you very much, Chuck. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's good to have something more than just Americans sitting here. We have a true international panel, and we're delighted that this idea came from Tish Long and from Chuck Alsop. On my left, initially we have Patty McGinnis. He is a Deputy National Security Advisor for Intelligence, Security, and Resilience at the Cabinet Office, United Kingdom. Then we have Christian Rousseau, Executive Director of the Canadian Integrated Terrorism Assessment Center, ITAC, Government of Canada. He is former military, served as Chief of Defense Intelligence in the past in Canada, and founder of the Canadian Armed Forces Intelligence Command. Next to him, we have Mr. Friedrich Gromas. He's head of Directorate TE, International Terrorism and International Organized Crime, Federal Intelligence Service in Germany. And he's been with the BND for 35 years, and he has served in the German Navy, and he also, I was told, was a lawyer. And then, of course, we have a man that needs no introduction either. That's Nick Rasmussen, who served as Director of the National Counterterrorism Center for the American government since 2014. Before that, for 2 years, he was a deputy head of NCTC. He has served with the National Security Council, with the Department of State. He is a remarkable American and truly one of the icons of this government through successive administrations. As a matter of introduction, I would like each of my colleagues to give about a 3-minute perspective on his view of global terrorism. How is the threat? How's it growing, or how's it decreasing? Each person doing for their countries in order to combat this. We see ISIS, the caliphate, going away in physical sense, but it seems to be a very enduring global threat, along with other groups like Al-Qaeda and similar terrorist groups globally. So I will start, before we get to questions, and ask Patty to speak about 3 minutes from Her Majesty's government in London.
Charlie, thank you very much, and thank you everyone for coming to this session, and thanks to our hosts. What a joy it is to be here. Actually, I want to start just with by saying a thank you. So there isn't a day that goes by that individual citizens of the United Kingdom, in the United Kingdom or overseas, aren't safer because of the work of the community that's represented in this room. And that's doubly true because there's a wonderful endeavor about the American intelligence community which infects those who work with it so that they also endeavor to improve. I like Tom Bossett's line yesterday about you don't have to be bad in order to improve. And my word, we learn a lot and gain a lot by working with you. So I want to say thank you first. Then my second thing to say is that I am the cuckoo on this panel, in that these good gentlemen here all do analysis and assessment to some degree or other, and tell policymakers what the problem is for the policymakers to fix. I am that poor policymaker. You know, I'm used to Nick's counterpart telling me, oh, by the way, the threat in the United Kingdom has gone to critical. You know, what are you going to do about it? And then I'm the one who has to agree with Theresa May what we do. So I'm the cuckoo. So if I sound like a policy guy, that's because I'm a policy guy. So I have 4 quick thoughts for you then about the threat. The first is, my word, we talk a lot about the threat, and this year in the United Kingdom we've had significant disrupted plots, but we've also had attacks that have got through. And we've had to talk to the public about this, and we began the year by saying that the threat was severe, an attack is highly likely, and here we are, an attack is highly likely, and meantime we've had a whole load of attacks, 4. And so there's something really interesting in the way in which we talk about threat, and the way in which we educate the public, of course professional colleagues, policy colleagues, but also the public about really what we're dealing with. First thought. Second thought, from the United Kingdom's perspective at the moment, we are facing a stratified threat, and almost our biggest risk is that we don't understand the different strata or the different segments of that threat and end up focusing on one of them. So it's very noticeable with European colleagues, particularly those who are not as active in the world as the United Kingdom, that they tend to concentrate almost wholly on Daesh, Islamic State, ISIL, whatever we're going to call it. We must agree, actually. And when you talk to them about the residual al-Qaeda, the way in which al-Qaeda is reorganized, when you talk to it about self-radicalizing people who may not be in their communities but are in our communities and are radicalized through the internet, they may not focus on that. So we're dealing with a stratified threat. We're dealing with a problem in our communities of people who do not travel. We're dealing with and become radicalized and move to violence. We're dealing with conspiracies that do not really involve an overseas element. Neither the attack at London Bridge nor the explosive attack in Manchester really had a foreign driver. These were British plots by British people. Their parents may have been from overseas, they were not. So we have a stratification issue that we need to address. My third thought for you is we have a fundamental problem when we think about the threat, and that is persistence. That there are groups over there, no matter how often they are degraded, no matter what geography they lose, who persist in certain things. They like attacking totemic buildings and sites. They like attacking aviation. They like the idea of chem, bio, radiological, and nuclear. And now they like the idea of cyber, even if they're really no good at it. And the thing about it is they just keep going, and they keep going, and they keep going, and they keep coming at us. And we have Darwinian effect when we work against them. When we work against them in terms of military suppression of the threat, and when we work against them in terms of the protection that we create in the aviation industry, in control of the sale of chemicals, in all of those things, they find their way through. And that persistence is the real issue with the threat that we're facing, that there isn't a single intervention that's going to see it off. And that's what we're learning, despite the endeavor of the people in this room, where you've had wonderful effect. We had wonderful effect in Afghanistan. You've had wonderful effect with the Pakistanis in the tribal areas. We have in Somalia. We have in Yemen to some extent. But we haven't broken that problem of persistence. And finally, and please ask me lots of questions about this, we've got a big problem with terrorism, and that problem is called the internet. Because when Mosul is gone now, Tel Afar is gone, when Raqqa is gone, when Qa'im is gone, down on the border between Syria and Iraq, the place where Islamic State are going to have us and hold us at threat is going to be online. They can hold us online because they can communicate without us being able to intercept them. We won't have lawful access to this data, as Tom Bossett said yesterday. They're going to organize themselves into groups. They're going to train people online. We see it happening. That's what Manchester was. And they're going to draw in new recruits. And if we do not address the issue of terrorist use of the internet, we are going to consistently fail in this task and not deal with that problem of persistence.
Thank you. Chris?
Thank you. Let me echo the notes from before. How privileged I feel to be part of this, to be back in Washington with old friends and new friends to talk specifically about terrorism. The idea that as you heard before, grew up on the military side. Well, collaboration and Five Eyes, beyond Five Eyes NATO is how you do intelligence on the military side. Certainly on the CT world, it has to work that way. And intelligence is very much based on trust. And trust is built by connecting together and actually exchanging like this. So the fact that we could be here, the fact that we can look at each of our view of terrorism, I think it just adds to our ability to do a better job or continue to do a good job in the future. Because we share Canada shares a border with the U.S. and we have the great privilege of having an ocean on each side, the way the terrorist threat looks to us is a bit different than it would look from Europe. So I thought maybe, and I don't want to certainly to insult your intelligence here, but put a bit the evolution of terrorism in context by using the old, new old term of 1.0, 2.0. So if you look at the original terrorism as it worked very much probably till 2000-ish, terrorism 1.0, it was all about, doing violence or terrorism for achieving political purposes, but in there the idea of the perpetrator achieving martyrdom at the same time was not part of it. You did terrorism, but you expected to survive that day to go and do another terrorist act somewhere else. So the bombing of the World Trade Center in '93, the Air India attack in 1985 in Canada are part of that. And then we really moved to the idea, and Al-Qaeda started this or really popularized that, the idea of achieving martyrdom when you do a terrorist act. So you're not trying to, you go once and you die at it, which caused a lot of issues for countering it, because once the person doing the act is ready to die in it, you can't dissuade them on the way there. You have to disrupt them well before. And of course, so the epitome of this would be the 9/11 attack against the World Trade Center, or the Paris attack by Daesh this time, the ISIL, the Islamic State, in November 2015. That would be, I would see that as terrorism 2.0. Terrorism 3.0, the generation of terrorism that is now most impactful in Canada for sure is the inspired or enabled terrorism. So as was mentioned, somebody goes on the internet, gets radicalized, gets told, as Adnani, so the Minister of War and Communications for the Islamic State back in September of 2014, came out in a speech and said, you know, guys, you don't actually have to come to the Islamic State to fight. It's better that you stay in your country if you can't travel and actually attack from there. And continue this idea of martyrdom. So die in your attack, but do it from home. And the two attacks in Canada, the two successful attacks in Canada actually happened within a month of that speech. Both candidates, both attackers achieved martyrdom, died, basically suicided by police as they were doing this. So now we're in a world that's even more difficult, because not only can't we not deter them, but they're going to attack you with a bladed weapon or a truck, and there are no signs to help us deal with this. And you will have noticed that certainly in the attacks in Europe, they often wear fake suicide vests. Well, that's not to cause more problems. It's just to make sure that they will not going to be taken alive, that they will be shot by police, so that they can achieve that martyrdom issue. And that is the primary threat in Canada. The ability of a organized threat directed from overseas, where people travel, money travels, things travel. We're relatively good at being able to catch that. So what we're not going to catch are the people that self-radicalize or radicalize online and then decide that day to go and do something. I'll just take one more minute to talk about the type of weapons, because these people are self-radicalized. They don't have the access to the technology, except reading they'll get on the internet. It'll be low sophistication weapons. I mentioned before, vehicles, bladed weapons. The thwarted attack of last summer in southern Ontario was a pipe bomb that in the end did not detonate. Well, it detonated, but not in the intended way, not killing anybody. So it's more difficult for those lone actors to actually do something. On the horizon are UAVs, because we see them being used in theater by bad guys who've managed to weaponize them somehow. That technology hasn't quite crossed the Atlantic, hasn't actually left the battlefield as a weapon, but certainly UAVs, we can just imagine how that somebody will get that great idea back in the homeland to this. And the last point on that, on this is the attack in Australia that was disrupted last month or 2 months ago now. It was clear in the press that there was a chemical disposal device as part of one of the devices that was there. So this idea of using chemical as a weapon, and the recipe on how to make this had appeared in Ramaya on the internet the month before or 2 months before. So clearly some of that gets picked up, and something that we have to worry about. The last piece that I'll talk about, terrorism in Canada, is right-wing extremism, because often one causes the other, and they work in tandem. There was an attack on a mosque in January of 2017 that killed six people and wounded another 19. It was certainly motivated by hate, and it has been characterized as terrorism. But in Canada, right-wing extremists are rather careful not to overtly propose or advocate violence. So it's definitely hate. It's a bit more difficult to call that terrorism, because the network that would provide this is not quite as apparent as with Sunni extremists. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Thank you. Friedrich?
Thank you very much for being invited in this esteemed group. I'm very glad that I can hear and talk to you about the threat to Germany, terrorist threat to Germany and Europe. The recent terrorist attacks, which claimed many casualties in various European countries, including Germany, are a manifestation of the mounting terrorist threat posed by jihadists to the Western democracies. Contrary to multiple media reports, the dangers emanate not only from the so-called Islamic State, but also from Al-Qaeda. The latter has never given up the goal of carrying out a major complex attack in Europe. The main reason for that fact is that a large-scale attack has not yet materialized, is that such plots have always been foiled through close cooperation among intelligence services. Thanks to intimate collaboration of security agencies, many of these plots are already identified in their planning stage, are tracked extensively, and can be foiled well ahead of their planned execution. What is more, many years of massive law enforcement pressure on Al-Qaeda have severely curtailed its capability and capacities. The past few years saw complex terrorist attacks, for example in Paris and Brussels, which were carried out by several perpetrators acting together in a coordinated manner. The most recent attacks, however, were committed by inspired lone wolves or by lone actors operating under orders or guidance. The weapons used in these attacks included explosive belts and firearms, and most recently also tools that are easy to obtain, such as knives and vehicles. The Islamist terror organization shifts in preference towards attacks by lone wolves or mini-groups is attributable to al-Awlaki, the former leader of Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, who touted leaderless jihad as early as 2010. The online magazine Inspire, created by him, also published concrete instructions for how to carry out terror attacks without leadership. Already at that time, there was a discernible trend towards simplicity in executing attacks. The terror groups had all realized that complex attacks plotting is highly susceptible to disruption. This gave rise to multiple appeals to jihadists to operate independently and to use everyday items as weapons. Hamza bin Laden, the son of Al-Qaeda founder, has recently issued an appeal for lone wolf attacks. The homegrown factor, too, has played a crucial role in numerous recent attacks, with ostensibly integrated young Muslim migrants or Western converts being inspired to commit terrorist attacks in their host countries. As a rule, they become radicalized through internet and through social media. In some cases, this is a rapid process. What is striking is that many of these people are petty criminals who were probably also radicalized in prison and who are not very strong in understanding Islam. Contrary to other European countries, the percentage of refugees among arrested and suspected perpetrators is disproportionately high in Germany. Refugees include both genuine refugees who became radicalized after their arrival in Europe and bogus refugees who were sent to Europe by the Islamic State leadership. The increase in importance of the Syrian-Iraqi theater of jihad has significantly heightened the potential threat from attacks by jihad returnees in Europe because, contrary to the former hotspot AFPAC, departees and returnees are more difficult to control due to geographic distance. In July 2017, the number of Islamists who had left Germany by Syria and Iraq to join jihad amounted to around 930, while the number of would-be jihadists who had left Europe since 2011 amounted to roughly 5,500. Besides the rapidly increasing number of jihadi travelers, the biggest problem is the comprehensive terrorist training, for example in IS camps, the combat experience gained and the brutalization resulting from a lengthy stay in the battlefield. The string of military defeats sustained by the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq suggests that a growing number of so-called foreign fighters might return to their respective home countries. At present, however, there is no hard evidence of a rising tide of fighters returning to Germany. We assume that many of them tend to resettle within Syria first and are then likely to be killed in clashes with Syrian and international forces. We have, however, identified an increase in the number of wives and children who are willing to return. This upward trend will probably increase in the months to come. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Friedrich. Nick.
Thank you, Charlie, and of course, thank you to the INSA leadership. There's no more important conference each year than this one for national security professionals, and it's a privilege to be here. It's also particularly a privilege for me to be up on stage alongside such close partners. Really, one of the most satisfying parts of my job is the engagement and the interaction I have with colleagues from our close intelligence partners. I'll just pick up on three quick points, some of them triggered by comments of my colleagues up here. And I'll start with the point that Patty made about stratification of the threat. We devote an intense amount of energy, intelligence collection activity and analysis at trying to peel apart the different parts of that stratified threat that we're facing, understanding whether threats are inspired, enabled, directed. And we do so because it points us in the direction of disruption. It tells you what you need to do to disrupt. The strategy you need to deal with the British citizens that Patty referred to is different than the tools and the strategy you're using to disrupt a cell run out of Raqqa or run out of somewhere in Syria or Iraq. And yet at the same time, as much time and effort as we put into peeling apart the different strata of threat that we face, I constantly have to remind myself and our analysts and our customers that in the end, those distinctions and the differentiated analysis I apply sometimes doesn't have a whole lot of resonance when you're speaking publicly about the terrorism threat. I may feel quite good about the fact that we have done a tremendous amount of work to prevent al-Qaeda from carrying out complex, multifaceted attacks that would have mass casualty effect here in the homeland. Does that make the citizens of Orlando feel any safer or any better? I would doubt that it does. Similarly, telling the citizens of Manchester that no, that attack there did not have a connection back to the ISIS leadership operating out of Raqqa probably isn't particularly helpful in making them feel safe or making them feel good about what their government is doing to protect them. And I say that not to be self-critical or critical of our partners, but just simply to remind ourselves that often the victim impact is what you need to keep in mind when you are speaking, particularly publicly, about the terrorism threat that we face. And so any sense of self-satisfaction that we may have about our counterterrorism efforts has to be weighed against the real-world impact that terrorist attacks have. The second thing I would mention is that the very differentiated and stratified threat that Patty referred to and that each of my colleagues has amplified upon has driven us in the direction of much closer, deeper, and more intimate intelligence cooperation. I think it'd be safe to say that if we were having this panel 10 years ago and we were talking principally about the al-Qaeda threat, I certainly would have been up here on stage with these partners because our partnerships would have been just as strong at that point. But probably the number of partners with whom we would have been so deeply and intimately involved in counterterrorism work probably could have been counted on two hands. The number of states that we were actually deeply working with every day on al-Qaeda-related matters probably did not number more than a dozen. In the ISIS world that we live in now, stipulating that ISIS is but one component of the threat environment we face. But in that ISIS environment we're dealing with right now, I would argue that number probably extends to 35, 40, 45, 50. There isn't really a country in Europe with which we're not deeply engaged in counterterrorism cooperation, operational, analytical, information exchange. And you can march your way around the world, the Middle East, North Africa, East Africa, Southeast Asia, Asia more broadly, and you can keep adding up countries and you quickly come to, as I said, 35, 40, 50 partners with whom I would argue on whom I would argue our security depends every single day, to Patty's point. And so that sharing, that level of cooperation extends well beyond the operational. It increasingly extends into the analytical as well. We know less. It's harder in some cases to get good intelligence. So the premium we place on sharing analysis with each other, on understanding the information, sometimes the limited information we have, the premium we place on that, I think, is greater than ever. And then the last thing I would say, by way of thinking beyond just this panel, the sharing of information that we do horizontally across our different intelligence services is something we'll talk about at some length today. But keep in mind also that certainly here inside the United States, the pressure is on us to engage in vertical information sharing as well. The ability to translate what we learn at a national level in our intelligence collection and analysis process, the ability to turn that into useful intelligence to state and local actors around the country here is something I feel increasing pressure on every day. It is not useful for me to know the details of the potential plot in a particular place overseas if I can't turn that into intelligence that also tells an airport security manager here in the United States how to do his or her job better, or someone who works in a sheriff's office, how they might deal with a Nice-style attack or an attack of the sort that took place at Manchester. So even as we focus on our international stuff here today, keep in mind that the intelligence enterprise that I'm a part of here has an increasingly important homeland security component. I would argue that we're better at this 10 years today than we were 10 years ago in terms of sharing that information, making it consumable and accessible to our state and local partners. I'm sure they would have a different perspective. They always want more. They deserve more than we're able to give them. But I feel pretty good that we know that is on our list of things to get better at, and we'll keep doing it. So why don't I stop there, Charlie, and look forward to questions.
Thank you very much. And you heard the theme here of violent extremism, radicalization. So I'm going to combine what's coming up on the iPad with some of the questions that I jotted down with my executive assistant and try to tease out a little more of this. I served in the George W. Bush administration where we worked on ideology, but things have changed. Violent extremism have conducted more attacks in Europe than the United States, in part because of proximity and the land corridor between the Levant and the Maghreb just across the Med. And also, most of the attacks, people that have, as said here by the panelists, have operated below the radar. But when you see the biblical influx, as Jim Clapper used to say, of refugees into Western Europe, is there more that the United States should do? Are the U.S. government, as well as the governments here represented, doing enough to counter violent, ideological, in this case, Islamic extremism? I'll start with Patty. He's already thrown out a big challenge in the area of the internet.
Thanks, Charlie. Well, so two thoughts really there. And I'm going to dive in into a segment of the problem which was referred to by colleagues here. So many of the people we're dealing with now who have gone to fight with Islamic State or are being radicalized in our communities or are acting from our communities to radicalize people in the United States or Australia, that's something we've seen over the recent years, are very young and know almost nothing about Islam, ideology, almost nothing. And the paperwork surrounding the Westminster Bridge attacker that he left behind was so superficial as to be almost not an indication of political motivation, and that which was in the van that was used, or the vehicle that was used at Finsbury Park Mosque by a far-right attacker, had almost no real ideological content. So whilst I don't want to get caught in that, it's wonderful, of course, the French would have an intellectual debate, a great intellectual fissure about, the nature of this. I still am struck that I think we're dealing with what, in these cases, with what Olivier Roy has been talking about as the Islamization of radicalization. Yeah? So that you've got people who are inclined to violence, they're looking for something and they stick a sticker on it and they find a justification, and their grip on their deen, on their religion, is so superficial as to be less than you'd get by watching a television documentary. So against that background, that asks some really significant questions about what we're going to achieve if we address ideology. So it's rather different from what, say, the Saudis have done in their de-radicalization programs, where they genuinely have people who have understood Surah Al-Baqarah and or have been educated about Surah Al-Baqarah in a particular way, and you want to undo that education. We don't need to do that with the people we're dealing with. That isn't the issue. The issue is something more of a sociological issue, first thought. So I think there is something to talk about in terms of countering the ideology and countering the message, but I think we run a risk of not actually addressing the immediate problem we have if we focus unduly on that with this current generation that we're dealing with in certain of the segments. So that's my first thought. My second thought is, my word, the internet is a wonderful thing. I know there's an argument about whether a British person invented it or whether it comes out of defense research in the United States. It's a wonderful, it's a wonderful thing, and it's a dreadful thing. And it's a dreadful thing in the way in which it facilitates a dissociated identification with individuals or ideas in echo chambers that means that people can radicalize very, very quickly. And I think we're reaching the point where we absolutely counter-message, we absolutely try and structure the way that people interact with the internet insofar as we can, including in collaboration with industry, in such a way that they don't reach the radicalizing content. But actually our issue is less about the detailed argument within the content, but the presence of the content at all. And I think we have reached the stage with Islamic State in particular, when if we are focused on the content of their communications online, of their presence, of the spaces within which they're interacting with others, we're not going to succeed. What we actually need to address is their presence online, is not allow them to be there and persuade the companies not to allow them to be there. That's what we've done with people who exploit children for sexual purposes. We've said, if you're a child sexual exploiter, even if you're putting up a picture of a fluffy pussycat, it doesn't matter. We're going to take it down and not allow you to use this state because we know what you're doing. And that's the way we have to be, I think, in this case, with Islamic State.
Friedrich, Germany's had the largest influx of refugees. You've had this massive problem of over 1 million that came in the fall of CY15, and then into 16. How do you feel about the whole problem of radicalization? Some of the people seem to be subject to this, and as you say, they may be young and have little knowledge of Islam or the Quran, but they join the cause. Is there any comments from your perspective on how to deal with this problem?
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. First of all, we have to register the refugees. We have to know who's coming in our country. That's the first step. I think this is already managed now since fall 2015. The second thing is we have to follow up the refugees to their various whereabouts, to their camps where they have to wait until their asylum proceeding and other immigration proceedings are processed. We have to see and to control, we the services, but also all members of society. It's a social problem. Members of society, they have to follow up them and take care of them. There has to be a sort of integration process, not just lock them up in camps until the end of the judicial proceedings comes. And we have to watch and to find ways and means to entertain those peoples, if I may say so, you know, to not to let young men just sit down and do nothing. We should be able to put them in a sort of working process or whatever. They have to be employed in a way, entertained in a way, watched in a way, so that we can see if there is a radicalization underway. Because in a couple of attacks, we could see that those people came as innocent refugees to Germany and were unfortunately radicalized in Europe or in Germany.
I see. Chris or Nick, you have anything to add on the violent ideology that seems to, and I do have a question on right-wing extremism, but say on violent ideological Islamic extremism.
If you don't mind, I would like to echo or jump on the comment from Patty here in the idea of religious ideology is very much the excuse. Radicalization and terrorism in that vein is very much a political radicalization to violence for political aims as opposed to the religious bit. On the radicalizations of migrants, the experience in Canada is that the first generation of migrants are very happy to be where they are. They remember directly how bad it was in the country that they fled. So we rarely see issues of radicalization in that first migration. The second generation is where it gets complicated because they feel disconnected from what their parents had. They don't quite feel completely welcome where they are now, or they don't quite fit, and those are the most the best recruits for potential radicalization. So I don't think, so certainly in the Canadian case, we're not too concerned about the people that have arrived in the last couple of years from war-torn areas, but we're on guard for what the next generation will do.
And that's an issue here in this country with second-generation Somali Americans. Maybe Nick would talk a little bit about homegrown extremism and what worries him the most.
Sure, and 2 points I'd like to make on just the broad topic of countering extremism. One is that my humility has grown pretty dramatically over time with this basket of issues. Patty referred to himself as the one policymaker here. Well, in a previous set of jobs, I had a somewhat similar position, and I was responsible at times for helping articulate strategies that said we would counter violent extremism in this part of the world or that part of the world, basically promising we would produce outcomes, and on time horizons that were utterly fantastical, probably at the time, but certainly in retrospect. And so when I think of the problem now of countering violent extremism, I can only get my head around it if I break it down into something more manageable. Otherwise, it seems to me like trying to boil the ocean. Trying to kind of move the globe in a certain direction just seems beyond our reach, and so I'd rather not waste time and energy and resources trying. Where I feel a particular obligation, though, to be very hands-on and very practical with the solutions we offer is here in the homeland. Our population of homegrown violent extremists, we have found, in most cases, there was somebody, somewhere, who saw, knew, or intuited that something was amiss. Up to 80% of the cases we've looked at very closely, along with the FBI, and up to 80% of the cases in recent years that we've examined closely, someone was aware of what was going on. And if there was the right touch, the right connection, the right intervention, it's possible that person could have been taken off of the path that they were on. That is not a catch-all, that is not a cure-all. But what it tells me is we have to do a much better job as an intelligence community and as a law enforcement community of making information available to community actors who are going to be there long before the FBI shows up, having opened a full-blown FBI full-field investigation. So that's where I think, hold ourselves to account much more directly. What are we doing to share information, to educate communities around the country about what they're seeing, what their immigrant populations, first, second, and third generation, are experiencing, and what we might need to do to take someone off of the path before they carry out a horrific act. I can get my head around that set of tasks in a way I can't get my head around solving conflict in every region of the world in which there is some version of a Sunni Islamic extremist problem.
Right. Thanks. And I'd like to turn just a little bit while staying on the whole issue of ISIS and radicalization. You know, ISIS sort of takes a converged approach to terror. They use cyber to radicalize, and then they use encrypted messaging to facilitate physical attacks. How can we better partner and leverage information sharing, threat intelligence on dealing with cyber terror, especially in thwarting attacks against our critical infrastructure? I think there's quite a bit in the press right now on potential threats to the critical infrastructure of this country. And how do you all view, I'll start with Patty, the going dark, the encryption problem that has been spoken about, particularly by the FBI's intelligence officers?
Wow, that's a big question, Charlie.
It is.
Isn't it? You've got encryption, you've got CNI.
That has some of the civil liberties in this as well. I have questions on civil liberties.
That's fantastic. That's almost half my job you've caught in one question. It's fantastic. I couldn't have thought of that question. Let me do the going dark a bit.
It's a good place to start.
It's a good place to start, not least because most of my visit this time and the last 4 times to the United States have been including testifying to Senate Judiciary Subcommittee and to the House Judiciary Committee has been exactly on this question, or one aspect of this question. So let me get into going dark. So undoubtedly we're going dark, and agencies are going dark, and that comes from a variety of things. That comes from Darwinian effect that we have through our success. That also comes, frankly, through the development of technologies, some of which are desirable, some of which, frankly, are not. And there's an objective of obstructing the state. And when Tom Bossett talked yesterday morning about lawful access to data, it seems to me that's just a critical thing to have in our minds, because it isn't only terrorism, but if we broaden it out, so much crime and harm that comes to the individual is now enabled in some way by network systems running internet protocol that we need to get into the point at which you reach a threshold where it is right for the state, for law enforcement, for intelligence agencies to have access to the content of those communications. Metadata is interesting too, but the content really matters. The thing I've been working on in particular is, when we talk about this, I must confess, we're talking with an industry. Some companies want their interaction with the state to be regulated and want to make a contribution. Some want to sell privacy and the fact they don't cooperate with the state and hope to win customers by doing so. I think that's reprehensible myself, but still. And that causes a degree of complexity. But one of the things that happens is that when you start talking about one thing, you're obstructed in achieving it because you talk about another. So what the British government is doing is it's picking it apart. As we say, we're trying to eat the elephant one leg at a time. and the leg I'm trying to meet, which is really important for 2 reasons, which I'll just quickly lay out, and really important for European colleagues in particular, but actually for all colleagues, is at the moment, American law constrains companies who are operating in other jurisdictions or providing services in other jurisdictions from honoring the warrants for intercept in those jurisdictions. And that's simply just a matter of American law. This isn't about spying or listening to the communications of Americans or foreigners within the United States, American person or US persons as they're described. This is simply about whether or not the British state can know if one person communicates with another using an American-provided application, as we find in over 95% of crime and terrorism cases, whether or not the British state can have data about that communication. And so I am pursuing a very simple thing, which is a piece of legislation, which I have the backing of this administration. The Obama administration was also supportive, to reach the point where a British warrant can be served lawfully for data relating to United Kingdom investigations, not US persons, on an American service provider, and they can provide data. They're safe, we're safe, the United States is happy.
Chris, could you speak about how on the whole cyber issue, the whole encryption question of ISIS, and you see it in Canada as well as here in the United States, and we have the whole, in Canada, under your Prime Minister, he has great respect for civil liberties, civil rights of the Canadian populace. Can you comment on this issue and how complex it is and difficult to find solutions?
Yeah, absolutely. I can try a bit at it. Rather complex, as you mentioned it. Come back to the point that Patty made about the ability of bad guys, terrorists, to use cyber weapons. So they advocate, or they talk big about being the cyber caliphate and all this, but when it's a question of doing an attack or impacting others, they're very much amateurs, not really quite in the game yet, although they're trying hard to get there. And eventually they'll find out how to contract criminal organizations that could do that for them, but we're still not there. Where they are actually very good at using internet and other cyber connections is in the recruitment, as we've talked about, using social media, and then have adapted in a Darwinian sense how they would do that. So they meet. It would be hard to meet in a dark spot because you can't attract anybody. So you do have an internet site or a chat group or whatever where you start talking on issues, and once you get a few hooks, then you invite them to go to a place that we can't listen. So that has become the mode of operation. So encryption is stopping us from being able to see the whole picture. We can see the invitation, but we can't see the conversation after they've been invited. Dealing with this, that connection between civil liberties, right of the states to know with the proper legal connections. It's an interesting concept because before the advent of communication technology like this, the state had reserved the right, and I'm sure it works in the U.S., it certainly works in Canada, I'm sure it's the same in Europe. The state, through the legal process, a judge could actually ask to know everything about me, or authorize the state to know everything about me. The only thing that we've reserved that the judge can't order me, or the state can't order me to do as a person, is the client solicitor privilege. If I'm talking to my lawyer, that's the only place that the state has said, okay, that's all right, that's off limit. But anything else that I do, the judge can ask me as I'm in the witness box where I was that night, what I was thinking about. I can be, all my personal thoughts can actually be out there for public view. But somehow, because we've put that in electronically, now we think that that becomes even more private than what I could do at that point. So at one point, as we evolve over this, for it to work, we actually have to reestablish that trust between the population, me as a citizen, and the state, including the safeguards that come from the judiciary, to be able to achieve those aims. So, but it has to be sold. It has to be convinced. That trust has to be regained. I think we're a bit behind from the government side on this, because as Patty was mentioning, a lot of for-profit organizations are trying to sell us the other idea.
Friedrich, the European Union and Germany put a great deal of concern into privacy, civil liberties. Yet, out of the Middle East and across from the Maghreb, you do face some increasing problems, it would seem to me, dealing with not just the messaging of extremists, but then dealing with encryption and then getting into the complex issue of how you deal with privacy. Would you like to elaborate on that? That's a big issue when you go to Brussels.
It's a good question towards a German. We have a very, very strict data protection law. Our public is very sensitive on Stasi and Gestapo methods. And therefore, we have this very strict data protection law. But I think there is a growing understanding that we have to adjust our legislation to the European level, to the French or to the British level, to have a certain balance between protecting privacy and discovering, of course, unlegal things like international terrorism. I think that's the first step, that we have to adjust the legal framework, and I'm pretty sure that this government, or in 14 days we have federal elections, next government will tackle this issue. But the other thing I wanted to stress is an address to the technical experts. What we have to find is some sort, because we have a mass phenomenon on data in the social media, we have to find and invent some sort of social media monitoring tool. I don't know if something like this exists, but I think we have to work on those things, because ISIL is vanishing from the soil. They're going cyber and internet, and we have to find the right tools, the technical tools, to fight them in this area.
Thanks. Patty has an additional comment, and I want to hear Nick's views as well.
So I agree with Frederick. I think there is an issue about what goes on in social media, and there is something that monitors it, and it's called Facebook, it's called Twitter, it's called Google. These are companies that process data for a living, and they know what's on their networks. And a British Parliamentary Commission, looking at the murder of a soldier in London in 2013, found that the British state could not have spotted and prevented the death of this soldier. He was half beheaded in the street, but Facebook could have. And I think there's a really compelling moral argument that results from that. And that would be my answer to your question about how that's monitored and how it's run.
Nick, you want to wade into this great issue of cyber and encryption?
Only in two very brief ways, and they aren't particularly prescriptive or taking us in the direction of solutions, but I will describe two things that we're doing to try to address how our terrorist adversaries are operating in the current media environment. First, because of the kind of engagement with communications providers that Patty is referring to, because that communication and engagement with those companies is so important, we are trying to broaden the aperture of information available to them. We are going to make sure that we burden them with knowledge about how their tools, their technologies, their platforms are being used. In some cases, that will lead them in the direction of more unilateral action they can take, and in many cases, we are told they prefer to be compelled rather than to act unilaterally. But I think in some cases we've seen positive action by companies acting on information they have themselves become witting of. So I think we are going to do everything in our power to share more information, to create more of a flow of information, not just on one-off basis, but in a regularized way, to try to drive them to take action on their own. Second thing I would say is, because of the way in which ISIS has in particular used this particular set of tools, it's changed the way we do, I think, the more hard-edged counterterrorism work in the conflict zones around the world where much of this material is being generated. Individuals who engage in that kind of activity are now, from our perspective, every bit as much of a threat to us as those who may be constructing IEDs or developing the kind of chemical technologies that Chris referred to, that we're concerned about with respect to dispersal of chemical weapon devices. So those individuals, if they're engaged in this kind of activity, are self-nominating in a way themselves into a new category, and they will be a much higher priority for the whole U.S. counterterrorism and international counterterrorism apparatus, whether that's collection or the full range of capabilities we bring to bear. I'm being deliberately vague on that.
Okay, thank you. And I'm bouncing back between the iPad and questions because they all seem to flow together. And this has to do with technology and future technology. We use it for a lot of good things, healthcare, dealing with a host of things like in finance and what have you. And yet we see and fear that our adversaries, whether it's state or non-state, promoting terrorism, that they will continue to use new technology. We have questions on, can artificial intelligence help with dealing with the threat of terrorism. What I would like to see was where do we stand in leveraging commercial technology? I know that innovation is occurring not just in Silicon Valley, but right across Europe and certainly in North America, Canada, as well as the United States. And then what about technology that terrorists may use? Certainly foreign states have the capacity, who are adversaries, to move toward bioterrorism, to WMD. And I've gotten questions from the audience on WMD. It worries me a lot. Bioterrorism really worries me. I think I will start with Patty and go to Nick, then to Friedrich, and then let Chris back clean up here.
So, I mean, there are two things to say. The first is, I think there is fantastic opportunity in partnership with technology industries in giving us advantage, and frankly, whilst we might have Darwinian effect, we might have really catastrophic effect on some of the techniques used by terrorists, and that's true in the information technology area. That's true with the companies I just mentioned. You know, they have the potential in themselves to come up with some answers to the kind of the Wizard of Oz effect that terrorist groups are able to create online, making themselves seem so much bigger and more compelling. But that's also true in terms of the movement of materials, of explosives, of radiological and radioactive material, chemicals of concern, combinations of chemicals of concern. You know, there's a fantastic opportunity for partnership and to give us advantage, and policymakers and the public some calm against the threats, the persistent threats that face us. So that would be my first thought. My second thought is we've learnt this lesson twice, haven't we? We've seen in Afghanistan, we had that extraordinary circumstances where there was the testing of chemical weapons and other weapons on goats, and there's famous Al-Qaeda videos, which I think we recovered during, you remember that? You remember
yes,
that?
Yes, sir, I remember it.
Yeah. Well, Mosul University has been an interesting place, and the innovative use of a variety of chemicals, including, as one of my colleagues, I think it was you, Chris, referred to, from UAVs, and you know, the weaponization of chlorine traps and all of these techniques. The lesson we learn is when there is space, and even a relatively low-level industrial base available to terrorists, they'll continue with their persistent pursuit of weapons that cause great fear and mass casualty. I think biotech is one which we have up there, and there is a risk, I suppose, that a terrorist group will get a volunteer who is a genuine biotechnologist, and that will take them somewhere. But to my mind, it's going to take that kind of thing for a breakthrough. Within the United Kingdom, one of my responsibilities is national resilience in the round. So I worry about things like pandemics and the way in which society is going to function if we do that. I'm sure everyone here does too, but I actually have to do some work on it too. And of course, once one gets into that, one begins to look at the issues one has around medical and biological threat, just natural biological threat. And actually, I think that gives us a lot of the answers in that area and the way in which to address it. So that would be my summary.
Nick, would you like to comment, please? It's a big issue.
I guess I would come at it maybe simplistically, but maybe even overly simplistically. One, I think I've always maintained some degree of confidence that we have a technological edge over our terrorist adversaries. Good news. Bad news is that technological edge has become more narrow over time for some of the reasons Patty identified. The access to information anywhere on the planet, plus the physical safe haven problem that continues to create opportunities for terrorist groups to create laboratories where they can operationalize these technologies. That there's no doubt but that technological edge that we've enjoyed has narrowed. The good news on the backside of that, though, is I think we can regain that technological edge in the way that Patty described. The job we face is to pedal as fast as we can on our current counterterrorism disruption efforts to make sure that during that period when we restore equilibrium, at least the equilibrium I believe is there, that we don't suffer the kinds of attacks that would leave us grievously wounded. And the reason I have that optimism is because I think at the end of the day, the level of resource, the level of innovation, the level of entrepreneurship available to our societies in total vastly, vastly exceeds that which is available to our terrorist adversaries, which leaves me optimistic, though very, very clear-eyed about the vulnerabilities we may face at any one moment in time.
Yes, we have about 4 minutes to go. I have at least one other important question. But Friedrich, what about the whole issue of future technologies and use by terrorism?
Well, first of all, I think the doors are wide open for public-private partnership. I think all the agencies are very much interested in the latest development and, to cooperate with private companies. Second remark is we have on the ABC threat, NBC threat by terrorists. I personally believe that, or we see in single cases that ISIL is trying to obtain commercial drones, and try to use them maybe, for dropping a dirty bomb. Yes. That is very easy to obtain and is similar of using a car or using a knife or whatever. So I think they will refrain from developing a complex chemical or biological attacks because they want to have the sudden spectacular blast, and the sudden spectacular blast is not being provided by a biological bomb. So I think we have rather to look if they use new technologies like drones or something like that.
Chris, how does Canada look at the threat of advanced technology in the hands of terrorists?
So I think the main point that I'll make is about threat being intention, capability, and opportunity. There is absolutely intention. We can see it, we can read it, we can hear them. They're fascinated with any types of weapons of mass destruction. Capability is a lot more complicated, and sometimes some of the stuff they talk about, you think it's a good thing they never went to school. But the idea of capability, of hiring somebody or managing to convince a biotech person to come on board would possibly is one avenue. But I think the real threat for us is the failure of imagination for us to understand the technology that we actually have. And just to take the 9/11 example, using planes, commercial planes that you can get in to do an attack. It's high technology. And so that technology, I'm sure, exists now. The type of a technology that we use day to day, but we fail to have the imagination that somebody that's ruminating in their cells or anywhere else for months at a time, at one point will go, and I have some of these ideas that I will not talk about because I don't want that to be the seed of somebody else. But there are some technology that exists that you don't have to master it completely. You just have to be imaginative on how to use it that could have those consequences.
Okay, lightning round, final question, because we've run out of time, my colleagues have told me. I cut my eye teeth on state-sponsored terrorism in the 1980s in Hezbollah, and I followed it in 1982 from its origin and followed it day and night, believe me, for years. Iran is considered by many experts to be an exporter of terrorism. There are differences in that. They continue to use Hezbollah inside Syria, and Hezbollah and Nasrallah remain very much active and have been so. How do you view Tehran's involvement in terrorism today, not just in the case of Hezbollah Lebanese, but they support Shia militants in the Middle East, South Asia, and where there are Shia militants, you seem to find some Iranian hand at some point. So lightning round, I'll start with Nick.
Well, I get the opportunity every year in testimony before the Congress to go on record on these issues, so I won't go too far beyond what I typically say. And that is that we take the threat of Shia-linked terrorism extremely seriously. I think we take it as a given that any state-to-state conflict involving Iran would invariably involve asymmetric tools that are available to Tehran. And so we view Hezbollah and Hezbollah in particular as being a global organization with global reach and global capability. And we are prepared to address that threat in that way if necessary. It is something that it never leaves our mind, even as we focus on ISIS and Al-Qaeda.
Patty? My word, we need to set ourselves to deal with this, and this goes to the first point, one of the points I made in my first intervention where I talked about stratification. This may be quiet at the moment, but these are people with phenomenal capabilities. These are people who had an ability against aviation in the 1980s, which arguably Islamic State and Al-Qaeda have only achieved this decade. So we need to set ourselves against them, but we need a slightly different set of tools. The tools we use against mass terrorism of a Daesh kind, or ISIL kind, are not those that are going to catch the Iranians out. We need the capabilities set against a state and a state actor. So they're the kind of the lower end of what we do against Russia. What we need to do against
Chris,
Iran.
you served in Afghanistan with the Canadian forces, and you saw aspects of Iranian influence in Afghanistan. Could you quickly?
Yeah, I think I'll build on what Patty said. When we're facing a non-state actor, a terrorist, there's only so many levers that we can use, although they can be very effective. When we deal with a state actor or state-sponsored terrorism, sometimes the lever that we have to touch are not the terrorism lever themselves or the counterterrorism levers, because at least as a state, they have other levers that we can press to make the use of terrorism as a tool more painful. And that's how I think is going to be dealt with.
Friedrich, how's Germany's view of Iran as an exporter of terrorism?
Well, I must admit,
there's always the JVPOA, we know, but I have a long memory of a guy named Imad Magnia, whom I spent day and night trying to find.
I must admit, I'm not very good on state-sponsored terrorism. You know, I concentrate on Daesh, on ISIL, Al-Qaeda, and so on. I just want to do a general remark. One of the jobs of foreign intelligence services is also to talk to the devil. So we talk also to those states, or we try to, who are being rightfully accused of sponsoring terrorism. Iran, as far as I see, is also in some way threatened by ISIL. We have to take into account that we have to talk what Islamic terrorism is concerned also to the devil.
Thank you very much. It's been a good and interesting conversation. Enjoyed it.
Thank you. Okay, we're gonna take a couple of photos up here in just a second. But I just wanted to say, Charlie, Patty, Chris, Friedrich, Nick, I think the very presence of you here doing this should give us all optimism that the cooperation is good, and we all know that it needs to get better. So thank you very much. For all of you, we're going to reconvene in here again at 1:15 sharp to hear from the directors of all of the national intelligence agencies. And then we will, without a break, roll right into a discussion between Tish Long, our chairman of INSA, with Sue Gordon, the new Principal Deputy Director of National Intelligence, to hear about some of our national intelligence priorities. So again, thank you, gentlemen.